It all began with a noise. Not music thumping through paper-thin walls, not the rattle of construction tools, and certainly not the joyous chaos of children at play. No, this sound was far more insidious, at least in the mind of Karen Middleton. It was the low, persistent hum of a vacuum cleaner. At 6 a.m., sharp, every single day. Karen lived in the center house on Maplewood Lane, a sleepy suburban street with neatly trimmed hedges, matching mailbox posts, and a homeowners association that prided itself on maintaining the tranquil aesthetic of a peaceful, orderly neighborhood. Her two-story colonial was spotless, both inside and out, and her security cameras, 5 of them, were positioned to cover every inch of her property line. Karen, recently retired from her job as an administrative coordinator, had declared herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood decorum. She had nothing but time and an endless supply of energy for surveillance. So when the Kleins moved in next door, Karen was already watching. Brian and Emily Klein were the kind of couple that made magazine covers. Young, fit, cheery. They moved, in with bright smiles and matching t-shirts that read, "New digs who dis," and they introduced themselves with a plate of cookies and a handwritten note. Emily had long, curly hair always tied back in a loose ponytail, and Brian wore shorts year-round, regardless of the temperature. He was a fitness coach, Karen overheard, and she took issue with his tendency to jog shirtless. Not appropriate for a family street. Emily ran an at-home baking business, which meant delivery cars and the occasional waft of cinnamon and yeast through the air. Fragrances Karen claimed triggered her migraines. Still, they were civil. Quiet even. They waved, picked up after their cats, kept their yard tidy. Karen made no formal complaints during their first month, though she documented their every move in her HOA incident log, a spreadsheet that included timestamps, perceived violations, and photo evidence. But then came the vacuum. It started on a Tuesday morning, exactly at 6 a.m. Karen was in bed, sipping her mint tea and scrolling through neighborhood alerts, when the low drone pierced her morning stillness. She sat up, her jaw tight. It wasn't loud. She could barely hear it through her double-paned windows, but it was there, like a mosquito buzz just out of swatting range. She walked to the window and looked out. Nothing. No cars, no foot traffic, just the glow of a porch light next door and, faintly, the unmistakable hum of a vacuum. At first, she assumed it was a one-off. Maybe Emily spilled flour or sugar and was cleaning before her morning bake. But then it happened again, and again. Always at 6 a.m., like clockwork, not a second earlier or later. After 4 days, Karen had had enough. She stood in her driveway, one morning in her robe and slippers, holding a decibel meter she'd ordered overnight. It barely hit 40 dB from the property line, well within residential limits, but Karen wasn't about to be silenced by numbers. She walked back inside, made a fresh cup of tea, and opened a new tab on her laptop. City of Oakbridge Noise Complaint Portal. In her submission, she cited intentional early morning disturbances, psychological distress, and health consequences from disrupted circadian rhythms. She wrote that the vacuuming was not just disruptive, but a targeted campaign of auditory assault disguised as cleanliness. She even added a footnote referencing a peer-reviewed study linking early morning noise to cardiovascular risks. Whether that applied to battery-powered vacuums was irrelevant. She clicked submit and exhaled like she'd just filed a police report. But Karen didn't stop there. She took to the Maplewood Lane Neighborhood Watch Facebook group and made a post. Some of us still work, or at least try to sleep past 6 a.m. I'm all for keeping a clean home, but must we start vacuuming before the birds are even up? Let's remember what being a good neighbor looks like. Silence is golden. The post received a few likes, mostly from other longtime residents who had either grown tired of the changing demographic or just liked any post Karen made. But the comments? Mixed, at best. One young neighbor responded, "Wouldn't it be worse if they vacuumed at midnight?" Another posted a gif of a vacuum being ridden like a scooter with the caption, "Let them clean in peace." Karen fumed. These people didn't get it. They weren't the ones startled awake by a buzzing sound that now haunted her dreams. She began recording videos from her upstairs window, tracking the exact duration of the vacuuming, usually about 15 minutes, and comparing it to sunrise times. She created charts. She plotted sound graphs. She even wrote a letter to the HOA board, folded neatly into an envelope with "Urgent Quality of Life Issue" stamped in red across the front. When the HOA finally responded, it was with a brief, lukewarm note that said, "We have reviewed your complaint and spoken with the residents in question. At this time, no violation has occurred, as their household activities fall within acceptable hours. We encourage all neighbors to practice mutual respect and communication." That last sentence felt like a slap in the face. Karen printed out the email and pinned it to her corkboard with a thumbtack shaped like a tiny gavel. Then she highlighted the phrase "household activities" in yellow and scribbled "blind to harassment" in the margins. If no one was going to take her side, she'd just have to escalate. She started photographing Emily's car in the driveway every morning, proof she was up early enough to choose not to vacuum. And all the while, the clients kept smiling. Always polite, always waving. Emily even left a fresh loaf of bread on Karen's doorstep one morning, tied with a gingham ribbon. Karen placed it directly into the trash. What really irked her, though, was that the vacuuming wasn't even that loud. She knew it, but it wasn't about the volume. It was about the principle. Who vacuums at 6 a.m.? Normal people waited until at least 9. Early risers might start laundry or drink coffee or quietly tiptoe around. But this felt intentional, disruptive, passive-aggressive, and Karen wasn't about to be outdone by passive aggression. No, she'd respond with full-blown, documentation-heavy, HOA-backed justice. Emily sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee, scrolling through the HOA app on her phone, her brow furrowed. She had just finished reading Karen's passive-aggressive Facebook post for the third time, and it still didn't make any more sense than it did the first time. Silence is golden. Was that about them? Brian leaned against the counter, munching on a banana, unbothered. "You think it's about us?" he asked, mouth half full. Emily looked up from her screen and gave him a dry look. "You think anyone else is vacuuming at 6 a.m? She wasn't angry. Not yet, anyway. Mostly she was confused. Their mornings were structured with almost surgical precision. Brian's military past meant he still woke up at 5 on the dot, did his stretches, showered, and made breakfast before, heading to his training sessions. Emily got up shortly after, threw on her apron, and began prepping dough for the day's baking orders. The vacuuming wasn't even part of a strict cleaning regimen. It was more of a personal sanity ritual. 15 minutes to tidy the rug and clear her head before flour dust covered the kitchen and cinnamon overwhelmed the air. The vacuum itself was cordless, soft roll, battery-powered. They chose it, specifically, because it was quiet. It didn't screech or roar or vibrate through the walls like a monster. It glided across the carpet like a whisper. But apparently, even whispers weren't safe from Karen's ever-watchful ears. Emily replayed the previous few mornings in her head. Had she been too loud? Maybe she bumped a chair? Did the cats knock something over? No, she knew better. She was careful. They were always careful. "I'm not stopping the vacuuming," she said finally. Brian nodded. "Good. I like our clean house." She smiled, but something sharp flickered behind her eyes. She wasn't mad. Not exactly. But she wasn't about to fold just because Karen didn't understand the concept of minding her own business. She'd tried the nice route. Cookies, waves, kind smiles. She'd tried being quiet and unobtrusive. And still, she found herself the target of some weird suburban turf war over carpet hygiene. so she had a thought. The next morning, Emily set her alarm for 5:59 a.m., 1 minute earlier than usual. The vacuum buzzed to life at 6 go, as always, but she'd already started cleaning. It was subtle, intentional, and maybe a little bit petty. But something about reclaiming that single minute felt like a small victory. The morning after that, she started at 5:59 again, then 5:58, then 5:57. Each day, just a minute earlier. Each day, still respectful, still brief, still quiet, but symbolic. It was a countdown, not to war, but to the breaking point of absurdity. At the same time, Emily began baking earlier too. If she was already up, she reasoned, might as well make use of the time. So by 6:15, the smell of warm cinnamon rolls or blueberry muffins drifted out of the open kitchen window. The Kleins didn't have central air. They loved fresh morning breezes. And apparently, so did Karen, who always left her bathroom window open during her morning yoga routine. Emily knew this because she often saw her silhouette in the frosted glass, contorting into warrior poses at sunrise. By the end of the week, Emily wasn't just vacuuming and baking early, she was doing it with a purpose. She started wearing her bake-it-till-you-make-it apron like armor. She even added a soft hum to her morning routine, singing bits of Fleetwood Mac and Norah Jones under her breath as she moved through her peaceful, clean home. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. Emily spotted her through the blinds one morning, dragging her trash can to the curb at 4 a.m., too full, hours earlier than normal. She wore her robe and fuzzy slippers and kept glancing up at Emily's house as if daring her to peek outside. The next day, Karen sat on her porch with binoculars and a notepad, scribbling furiously every time she saw movement behind the curtains. The trash can started showing up daily at random hours, sometimes with nothing in it, like a weird psychological tactic Emily couldn't quite decode. Then came the white noise. Emily and Brian first heard it while brushing their teeth. A dull, rushing sound, like a fan trapped in a tunnel. They peeked outside and spotted small white noise machines placed in Karen's bedroom and living room windows, both facing their house. At first, they laughed. Who buys outdoor-facing noise machines to block out the sound of a cordless vacuum? Brian suggested writing a parody song. Emily just baked an extra batch of cinnamon rolls. But Karen wasn't giving up. The next escalation came in the form of flyers. Handwritten, photocopied, and folded into mailboxes along Maplewood Lane. They read, "Are your mornings disturbed by unnecessary noise? We're gathering signatures to push for stricter sound regulations. Join the Quiet Neighborhood Initiative. Together we can restore the peace." Emily held the flyer in her hand and shook her head in disbelief. She had lived in cities where car alarms screamed all night, where neighbors screamed even louder, where vacuuming at 6 a.m. would have been a luxury. And now, in the peaceful suburb where she was baking bread for neighbors and cleaning, her home with care, she was suddenly a criminal in Karen's eyes. Still, she wasn't angry, not deeply. What she felt was more like amusement, curiosity. She wondered how far Karen would go. A noise complaint? Really? Then came the breaking point. On Friday morning, Emily was returning from a grocery run when she found a small envelope taped to her front door. No stamp, no name, just "To the Kleins," written in neat, looping cursive. Inside was a typed letter, 3 full pages, outlining Karen's experience of psychological distress caused by repeated early morning disturbances, complete with screenshots of her sleep tracker app and a bullet point list of suggested compromises, including only vacuuming on Tuesdays, waiting until 9 a.m., or agreeing to a written silence agreement. Emily read the letter, laughed softly, and handed it to Brian without a word. That night, over wine, they decided something important. They wouldn't fight Karen, not with harsh words or more noise, but they also wouldn't back down. Emily would continue vacuuming when she needed to. She would continue baking. And she would keep smiling when Karen walked by. because nothing unraveled a control freak like someone who simply refused to be bothered. So the vacuum stayed. The cinnamon rolls got fluffier, and every time Karen scowled at them from behind her hedge, Emily made a mental note to wake up just 1 minute earlier. Karen had always considered herself the moral compass of Maplewood Lane. She prided herself on maintaining standards, keeping the peace, and standing up for what she believed was right, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. But now, standing in front of the local courthouse holding a folder stuffed with printed screenshots and annotated photos, even she had to admit this was escalating beyond her usual neighborhood tiffs. She marched inside, chin high, resolve stiffened. Her request? A restraining order. Not for threats or physical danger. No. This one was for what she described as psychological harassment through sound manipulation. The clerk behind the plexiglass barrier blinked slowly as Karen explained her case, laying out her folder like it was evidence in a criminal trial. She pointed to her notes. "Look here," she said, tapping one page. "The vacuum began at 5:57 a.m. on this date, and then 5:56 the next. Do you see the pattern? It's intentional. It's escalating. It's warfare." The clerk, to his credit, didn't laugh. He simply handed Karen the required forms and informed her politely that she would need substantial proof of targeted harassment for a restraining order to be considered. Karen left, indignant but undeterred. She had proof. What she didn't have was sympathy. Her next move was more dramatic. She contacted the local news. Channel 12's Neighborhood Watch segment loved a quirky story, preferably something light for the midweek slot. Karen pitched it perfectly. She painted herself as the victim of a hostile neighbor campaign, a woman under siege by a deliberately disruptive domestic appliance. She even crafted a catchphrase. "We have laws for leaf blowers, why not for vacuums?" To her delight, the reporter bit. They arranged an interview, set to take place in Karen's front yard at the crack of dawn so the vacuum could speak for itself. She prepped for it like it was her Oscar moment. Makeup done, hair curled, patio cushions fluffed, and at 5:59 a.m., right on cue, the low hum of the vacuum started up next door. She gestured dramatically toward the house. "Do you hear it? That's how I wake up. Every day. That sound. That vibration. It rattles my bones," she declared, eyes wide for the camera. The segment aired later that night and promptly went viral for all the wrong reasons. Clips circulated online. Twitter had a field day. Karen discovers people clean their homes. Imagine being this mad about a vacuum. Live look at Karen being haunted by a Roomba. Even the local subreddit turned on her with one user photoshopping her face onto a horror movie poster titled The Cleaning. It wasn't just online either. Karen's own neighborhood began to sour. People who once nodded at her during evening walks now crossed the street. Someone left an Amazon box on her porch filled with earplugs and essential oils. Her next-door neighbor on the opposite side, Mrs. Espinoza, who rarely got involved in any drama, passively mentioned how she admired the Kleins for being so tidy. But what really stung? The HOA board's letter. Karen had written to them 3 separate times, demanding they take action. She accused the Kleins of violating unwritten neighborhood etiquette and framed her complaints as a defense of community well-being. But the board, after a closed-door meeting, issued a different kind of notice, one addressed to her. The letter was firm and professionally worded, but its message was unmistakable. The board acknowledged receiving multiple complaints about Karen. They cited instances of confrontational behavior, abuse of the community message boards, and misuse of HOA authority. They formally requested she relinquish her self-appointed role on the civility committee and removed her plaque from the clubhouse wall, the one she'd donated herself, engraved with her name and motto, "Courtesy is contagious." Karen sat on her couch that evening, reading the letter over and over again, her cat purring beside her, completely indifferent to the collapse of her social empire. She tried to regain control. She filed another noise complaint, this time with the county. It was rejected. She typed up a mass email to the neighborhood, warning that what starts with vacuuming ends with chaos, but only 2 people responded, and both were confused. She called the local librarian and asked if they had any soundproofing grants for residential victims of domestic audio aggression. The librarian kindly offered her a pamphlet on meditation. By the weekend, Karen wasn't just losing a fight, she had become the joke. And worst of all, the Kleins still hadn't said a word. Not one. They hadn't confronted her, retaliated, or even acknowledged her theatrics. Emily continued to vacuum. Brian continued to jog. They waved, smiled, baked, and Karen began to feel something unfamiliar, shame. For the first time, she saw herself through someone else's eyes, standing in her driveway at sunrise with a camera, tracking her neighbors like a wildlife documentary, screaming into a microphone about a vacuum while the rest of the world rolled their eyes. She started noticing the small things she had ignored before, like how Emily always returned her trash cans from the curb with the wheels turned inward, so they didn't block the sidewalk. How Brian helped Mr. and Mrs. Delaney carry their groceries every Thursday. How the Kleins shoveled their walkway and the shared sidewalk in front of her home during that last frost. It began to sink in slowly what she had really done. But it was hard to let go of righteousness. It had become her armor. Without it, she was just another woman with too much time and not enough peace. Yet no amount of complaints or viral clips or HOA letters could make the sound stop, because the sound was never the real issue. She wasn't angry at the vacuum. She was lonely, and maybe, just a little bit, jealous. Jealous of a young couple with purpose and joy and cinnamon-scented mornings. Jealous of their ability to shrug off chaos, to stay composed and kind, and still bake something warm every day. She didn't want to admit any of that, not out loud, so instead, she did nothing. She stayed quiet. She stayed inside. And for once, she didn't call the city or post on Facebook or wave her HOA handbook like a weapon. But the silence was louder than any vacuum ever had been. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Karen finally broke her silence. Not with words, but with something far more unexpected. Emily had just stepped outside, still in her flour-dusted apron, a tray of cranberry scones cooling beside her on the porch rail. She spotted Karen out of the corner of her eye, walking slowly down the sidewalk with a small paper bag in her hand, looking nothing like the neighborhood watchdog she'd once been. She wasn't clutching her notepad or glaring through binoculars. She looked ordinary, human. Emily straightened up, unsure what to do. Offer a wave? Pretend she didn't see her? After everything that had unfolded, she wasn't even sure where they stood anymore. Karen hesitated by the walkway, eyes lowered, then took a breath and turned in. "I brought you something," Karen said, voice so soft it almost startled Emily. She held out the paper bag like it was a peace offering. "They're lemon cookies. I know you bake, but I thought I'd try." Emily blinked. Of all the endings she had imagined to their months-long standoff, lemon cookies had not made the list. "Thank you," she said carefully, taking the bag. "You didn't have to do that." Karen gave a quick shrug, then stood awkwardly, like she wasn't sure if she should stay or go. "I guess I just figured I owe you an apology, or at least a truce." Emily's lips curved into a smile, gentle and cautious. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Karen nodded, almost too quickly. "Sure." Inside, the air smelled like vanilla and citrus zest. The cats padded around their feet as Emily poured 2 mugs and gestured to the breakfast nook, the sun streaming in across the table where still warm scones sat cooling beside a jar of homemade raspberry jam. Karen sat stiffly, mug cradled between both hands. She glanced around the room, taking it all in, the cheerful teal backsplash, the family photos on the fridge, the tidy stack of recipe cards in Emily's neat handwriting. She looked down at her cup. "I used to bake," she said, almost to herself. "A long time ago, before everything got scheduled." Emily tilted her head. "Before the HOA. Karen gave a short, dry laugh. "No. Before me. Before I decided everything had to be just so." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, "I think I forgot how to be a neighbor. I was too busy trying to be in charge of the neighborhood." Emily didn't answer right away. She took a sip of coffee, then broke a scone in half and offered it to Karen. "Being in control is a hard habit to break," she said. "I think we all do it sometimes, in different ways." Karen accepted the scone, took a small bite. Her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. "I was angry," she admitted, "but not at you. Not really. It's just, the world moves on without asking if you're ready. My husband died 3 years ago. He used to get up early too. Clean the gutters, rake the lawn before the sun was up. I hated the noise back then, but after he was gone, the silence became unbearable." Emily's gaze softened. "I'm sorry." Karen waved her hand, brushing away the pity. "It's not about grief anymore, not exactly. It's more about what fills the silence after, what you cling to." She shook her head. "I clung to order, to rules, to making sure things were still tidy, predictable, manageable. Like if I kept everything clean enough, nothing else could fall apart." Emily understood more than Karen realized. "And the vacuum?" Karen gave a wry smile. "It wasn't about the sound. It was the reminder that someone else's life was moving forward while mine stood still. That you had energy, a rhythm, a purpose. It wasn't fair to blame you, but I did." Emily nodded slowly. "It's okay. We all carry things we don't know how to name." The two women sat in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of mugs and the soft purr of a cat curling against Karen's leg. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed quietly with the start of a new day. Bikes on sidewalks, sprinklers hissing, lawnmowers humming in the distance. But here, inside this tiny kitchen, it felt like a reset button had been pressed. Karen glanced at the time. "You know," she said, "I don't even hear the vacuum anymore. Not really. Maybe I never did." Emily chuckled. "It's battery-powered, practically silent." Karen rolled her eyes. "Don't rub it in." They both laughed. Really. Laughed, for the first time in months. It was a small thing, but it felt seismic. As the morning stretched on, they swapped stories about burnt cakes, ridiculous HOA meetings, neighbors who never returned casserole dishes. Karen told Emily about the time she once tried to teach yoga in her backyard and accidentally fell into her own koi pond. Emily countered with the story of the time Brian tried to fix the dishwasher and flooded the entire kitchen, prompting a heroic rescue involving towels and a shop vac. It was a slow unraveling of tension, thread by thread, woven back together with warmth and understanding. And by the time Karen finally stood to leave, her face was softer, her voice lighter. "Thank you," she said at the door, "for the coffee, and for not slamming the door in my face." Emily smiled. "Any time. And hey, your lemon cookies aren't half bad." Karen grinned, the first genuine grin Emily had ever seen from her. "Next time I'll bring snickerdoodles." As she walked away, Emily watched her go, not with suspicion, not with weariness, but with something new. Hope. Maybe even friendship. Later that week, a new post appeared on the Maplewood Lane Facebook group. This time, it wasn't a complaint. It was a photo, Karen holding a tray of cookies standing beside Emily, both of them smiling, flour smudged on their aprons. The caption read, "Turns out, peace is best served warm, with a side of baked goods." The comments poured in. Dozens of likes. Neighbors tagged each other. Someone even suggested organizing a block-wide bake-off. Brian offered to be a judge. Even Mrs. Espinoza chimed in. About time. Now please settle the leaf blower drama. Next. Emily laughed when she read that one. And that night, as the vacuum hummed softly at 6 a.m., there were no glares from across the street, no white noise machines, no flyers in mailboxes, just the smell of fresh muffins rising in the oven, and finally peace.